Well, I'm glad I've got an audience. How nice to see you all. When I was thinking about this lecture, one of the things I thought about was actually portraiture has sort of found me. I never set out as an artist to be in any way a portrait artist. So I'm going to take you on a very fast whistle-stop through my career, because I think the only way to understand what I do is to understand the relationship between ideas and form and content in my work. So it's going to be a story I'm going to tell you, really. My big interest is in the relationship between the self, what it feels like being me, what it feels like being you, and this rather funny jelly-like object inside our skulls. The brain is a quite extraordinary thing. Neuroscientists are looking at it and exploring it all the time, but nobody really quite understands why this lump of extraordinary jelly should make a self, so that we wake up every morning quite simply feeling I'm me. And also they don't understand how it gives us imagination. And so my work is an exploration into what it means to be a person, be it me, or more recently and more interesting for me, what it feels like being you. So in order to find some of those narratives that make up a person, I work with neuroscientists, I've worked with medical doctors, I've worked with various individuals with different neurological conditions, and I try and pull all these different narratives together. My portraits here at the National Portrait Gallery and generally are not of celebrities or famous people. My work is always of extraordinary but ordinary people, because it's the experience of them being themselves that is interesting to me, the subjective them, rather than the objective, showy stuff that we are in the world. I'd just quickly like to, and I mean this rather than sort of doing a blind thank you, I am really, really thrilled to be showing at the National Portrait Gallery, because it's a gallery I love, and to me the place to show quite radical portraiture is in a place where portraiture is taken so seriously from the very earliest portraits right through. And I'd like to thank Inga Paul Morehouse, and I'd also like to thank my agent Robert Devchik for his wonderful support. Now I'm going to get on. And finally, everybody who's ever agreed to sit with me, because actually, if I make a portrait of you, it's quite demanding. So beware. My daughter Maud found this quote from Picasso: "Are we to paint what's on the face, what's inside the face, or what's behind it?" If I'd been working 100 years ago, I think I would have been an expressionist. I think it would have been the theories of Freud and Jung that inspired me. I would have been interested in the psychology of who we are. But I'm not. I'm working now in the 21st century, where I think that neuroscience is offering all of us, not just artists, but writers and scientists and everybody, an explanation of who we are. It's a materialist explanation. It suggests that if we understand how the brain works, we'll understand what it is to be human. I should also point out now that I have no interest in solving any of these neuroscientific problems. I'm just interested in posing them and exploring them in my work. This is the thing that actually made me start making portraits. This is a brain scan of my own brain. So, unlike the rest of you, I know that I've got one. I was having a routine brain scan, and I watched this image live on a monitor while I was having the brain scan, and I just couldn't believe what I was thinking, because the truth is, until that point, I'd always thought of myself as an external surface. I'd never really thought about the anatomy of myself and the relationship of it to what it felt like to be me. Was I watching myself think? And so I went back to work with the consultant who'd done the scan, and he let me sit for about 2 years every Tuesday morning watching other people having brain scans. And I drew, because drawing is what I do in order to understand a subject matter. It's my way of reflection. So I was allowed to sit in the hospital watching people having brain procedures, and when I watched them, I was watching them on the operating table, but I was also watching what was going on inside them, their brain scans. So it was a bit like the drama of them on both levels. These are some of the drawings I did on location. And at these very early stages, I was beginning to ask myself questions, what is consciousness? What is the relationship between those extraordinary wiggly arterial lines I'm seeing and the person who's lying on the operating table? This was a series of drawings of a small boy who was having a procedure done in his brain, and I found them very moving because a small child has 2 sets of teeth in X-ray, and there's something rather sort of profound about them. So whilst I was working with these drawings, I was accumulating thousands of them, but they still weren't amounting to a body of work. And at the same time, I was appointed artist in residence at the print department at London Metropolitan University. And here I met an extraordinary printmaker called Nigel Oxley. And sometimes, for me anyway, I need to find form for my work. I'm a very technical artist. I want to make pictures that work as a piece of technical work. So meeting Nigel was very exciting because he understood what I was doing. I presented him with a drawing like that, and I said, can I translate this into etching? The only thing I knew was that I wanted all the marks to be white, because I thought they reflected brain scans and X-rays. And also, to me, the paper's shining back in through the white marks. It's a way of suggesting the self. We went on to make 30 etchings called brainscapes. So in a way, my beginning as a portrait artist was really a landscape artist. These are landscapes of the brain, but they are the landscape of a person. In that sense, they are a form of very abstract portraiture. About this time, I started talking to neuroscientists about what they knew about the brain. And I'm not going to begin to talk about that because I don't understand it enough. But what became very clear to me is that there's a real problem with scientists, with consciousness and the feeling of being a self. Being yourself is essentially a subjective, personal experience. It's the sort of area that scientists find it very hard to look into because the scientific world is about objective truth. It's about truth that you can measure and quantify. And so, although I'm sure we will find out how consciousness emanates from the brain, the experience of being conscious is something that maybe artists and writers have a lot to offer in explaining. And so for me this work is about the objective brain, those are the marks of the arteries, but also Nigel and I invented a way of making chemical explosions on the plate, so I wanted to suggest an idea, a mind at work, someone in there. This is a piece of work called Birth of a Thought, and I wanted to put it up here on the screen to show you that I have quite a tricky relationship with science. Some of my work, this is Birth of a Thought too, and it looks like it's scientific, but actually this is a load of old imagination. This is what I feel is happening when I have a thought in my brain. Sometimes I feel, it's something bubbling at the back and it sort of comes to the foreground. So these are imaginative, quasi-scientific illustrations of what it is to think. Paul Brox is an interesting writer. He's a neuropsychologist who actually has redefined himself really as a writer. And I think this is a wonderful paragraph that sort of explains a lot of what I'm looking at. The harder one stares into the machinery of the brain, the starker the realization that there is no one in there. There is no inner sanctum of the self. Neural networks have a life and logic of their own. There is no one running the show, i.e., the philosophers in the past, like Descartes, used to think that there was a difference in type in your body between mind and body. And I think what neuroscience is showing us now is that actually the brain is all there is, and we can see it working on a scan. So in a sense, we have to, as 21st century people, I think, philosophically look at this. The self is a shadow puppet shaped by the firings of 100 billion brain cells. These are conceptual conundrums, intractable to current science. They call for an artistic response. I underwent a different sort of brain scan, this time not diagnostic one, but really to make art. And this is an MRI scan. And I decided to use the scan itself in order to show what a scan might look like if it showed an imagination at work. That's called Cogito Ergo Sum 1, I think, therefore I am. So these are all very early self-portraits, really. And this is a word portrait, where I sort of, up there it says, I'm going out of my mind. And I probably was at the time thinking about all this work. Finally, I decided to use the imagery, but actually turn it into a very, very graphic statement. A brain scan is about 0.5 metre big. This piece of work is 2.5 metres big. It's very colourful, it's very graphic. And I think I wanted to take ownership of a brain scan, because brain scans are used in newspapers, are used everywhere to sort of signify the brain. I wanted to take this very much as a piece of art. Can you see me? I'm inside and outside. And through the work, suggest that it's a sort of self-portrait. It's actually my own brain scan there, so it is me. And to see if portraiture can also deal with the internal as well as the external. These couple of fellows I made for the Cheltenham Science Festival a few years ago, they're called There's No Ghost in the Machine. René Descartes, the philosopher, as I was saying earlier, he described the difference between the soul as one thing and the body as a different thing. And I think neuroscience must make us question that. And so this piece of work is just simply two ghosts that hang around together, and that's all they are. One of the ways that scientists work, and it's something that I've taken from science, is to look at people with brain conditions in order to understand more what's going on in the brain. So you can see what's missing in a brain, or what's been changed or is ill in a brain, in order to understand more perhaps how a brain works. A few years ago I was commissioned to do a project with a number of people with Alzheimer's by Westminster Arts. And I met 3 extraordinary people, Joan, Mary and Peggy, and they were very happy for me to make portraits of them, but they were descending into a form of dementia which was very traumatic to watch. And I made 3 portraits. Again, I worked with Nigel Oxley at London Metropolitan, and we made a way of, I don't know if you can see there, that her face is just about visible in the etching. These etchings are called dissolution. I wanted to make a piece of work that shows how the self, a portrait of someone who is, in a sense, through their dementia, disappearing. The marks that are holding the portrait together are the marks of the plaques that you get in the brain in dementia. This is Peggy. And finally, Mary, and you can just about make out one very, very beady eye on the right of that. I have these works get shown quite a lot, and I have quite a lot outside of being an artist. I think politically our society needs to think a lot about what's happening with ageing and what we should do about it. And I think these portraits, I'm very glad that they get shown a lot, because I feel that they maybe make some questions about both who we are, but maybe we need to organise society differently. My next project was called Reassembling the Self. I was appointed artist in residence at the Institute of Neuroscience at Newcastle University, which was a fantastically exciting project. I was working with clinicians, I was working with basic scientists. They're neuroscientists, but they're called basic scientists, and believe me, they weren't basic, they were damned clever. And the project was about trying to understand what schizophrenia is, and I'm sure many of you have read the literature on schizophrenia. It's a very complicated condition, and it's also a very complicated label. So I was trying to make work that explored it but didn't make any comment on it. These 2 portraits were made by Kevin and Camille, who were the 2 artists with schizophrenia that I was working with. And it rather wrong-footed me, because I felt I couldn't make portraits of them that were anything like as powerful as the self-portraits they made of themselves. And I had an exhibition to fill. So I talked to them and I decided to make word portraits from their own words. I didn't want to put my thinking into the works at all. And I made these 2 word portraits, which were made from the words they talked to me about the hallucinations they had. And, you know, the writings on the wall. I had quite an emotional reaction to schizophrenia by talking to Kevin and Camille. One of the things that Camille talked to me about was the fact that she had always wanted to be a doctor, and she got diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was 17 years old, and she felt that it had stolen her future. So I decided to make portraits of the schizophrenia rather than of her. And in a way, I think these are portraits of something to do with the way I felt that the brain had sort of changed who they were. At the same time that I was making these works, I got an Arts Council grant to go and work with the legendary Stanley Jones at the Kerwin studio to have my first attempt at lithography. Lithography is a fantastic medium for seamlessly putting together lots of different layers of work. And here I put together, these are plate lithographs rather than stone lithographs, and I put together drawings, anatomical illustrations and colour to make these very, very powerful and I think quite brutal and aggressive portraits of schizophrenia itself. These ones are, I think, quite feminine, quite masculine. For me, the one on your left, my right, is a portrait of Camille, and this one's a portrait of Kevin's schizophrenia. And we took them further into lithography, which meant that I could then draw and colour on top. And they're very, very painterly, and it's a very, very fabulous medium. These 2 beautiful specimens can be found in the Hunterian Museum in London. They're called the Evelyn tables. The Evelyn tables, I think, they were discovered in 1694. I don't know how old they actually are. They're thought to be some of the oldest anatomical presentations in the world. And I don't know how they made them, but whoever dissected the bodies then stuck the arteries and the nerve systems down onto these beautiful pieces of oak. And I've always found them extraordinarily powerful pieces of work that, in a sense, describe the anatomical person. So I based this piece of work, which is a very large life-sized lithograph. It's another self-portrait. And it's a portrait about anatomy. It's a portrait about nurture in nature. It's a portrait about the extraordinary fragility of who we are, the fragility between the anatomy that is ourselves and the things that can happen to us that might change it. This is another portrait, self-portrait called Self. We're also determined by our sort of hormone system. And this is a self-portrait done by something called eye tracking, which I did at the Institute of Neuroscience. When you draw without any hands at all, you just draw with your eyes. And in a way, it's an interesting portrait because it shows how I, as an artist, and in particular, look at people's faces when I draw them. So it's a bit self-referential, that one, but nonetheless, I think, worth showing. So I then come on to the major project, which is the project that I'm showing here at the National Portrait Gallery, the Portrait Anatomised. In 2010, I was commissioned by Guy's and St Thomas's charity to do a project for the walls of their neurophysiology department at St Thomas's Hospital. That's the department where epilepsy is diagnosed and treated. I didn't know anything about epilepsy, and I went my normal route, which is to meet up with a consultant there, Michael Koutamanides, and he introduced me to Fiona and Elizabeth, who were 2 of the people I've made portraits of. What I learnt very quickly from all the narratives is that epilepsy has to do with electricity in the brain, too much electricity at times, and that impacts on the circuitry in the brain, and that can give you an epileptic episode. The other thing I learned is that there are as many types of epilepsy as there are people with epilepsy. So it seemed to me that I wanted to make portraits of particular people rather than going for something very, very general. The first person who sat for me was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is an extraordinary person. But she was very, very worried about not being able to have children, because one of the things you have to sort out if you have epilepsy is the medication that you take. And there's the medicated self, that's another narrative. So you've got your scientific self, your anatomical self, your personal self, and your medicated self. And in order to take the risk to have a child, Elizabeth had to decide whether she was going to come off the medication. So I played with the portraiture here. I used EEGs, which are the marks either side of the skulls, to give an idea of what was going on with the electricity in the brain. I also worked with something called chine collé, which is a form of print where you can actually bring, usually you work with coloured papers. I use digital photographs into my work. And I built up this portrait of Elizabeth. I put her face where her womb was, because I felt that was, in the moment that she was sitting for me, it was the bit of her that she felt, it was what we talked about, having a child. The extraordinary thing was, when I actually began to make these pictures, Sarah Howgate came round, the contemporary curator from the National Portrait Gallery, to have a look at the work. And she said, "Oh my goodness, you've made a series of crucifixions." And it's another problem you have about yourself. You can't escape who you are. I was brought up Italian Catholic, so there we are. I can't help it. And these are called Arma Christi. They're pictures which I've always loved of the weapons that Christ used in the Bible and to fight the devil. And maybe it's not a conscious thought. There's so much that goes on as an artist in your mind, but certainly this imagery resonates through the portraiture. And that brought me onto another portrait. When I saw this Arma Christi, then I realised that a few years ago I was part of a wonderful exhibition called 400 Women, where 400 artists in London were commissioned each to do a portrait of one of the women who'd been murdered in Chihuahua in Mexico. There's a huge problem with this particular town, and it's not the time to go into the project now, but it's really worth looking at. And I did this portrait of Eusenia, and Eusenia was 16 years old and never came home from school one day, and it was very upsetting. So I made the portrait for her mother, because I'm a mother of daughters too. That link is just to show you how things tie up. Anyway, back to the National Portrait Gallery. The next portrait I did was of a portrait of a very dear friend of mine called Max. And Max is someone I've known for about 20 years, a very dear friend, and I've always known he had epilepsy, but it was never a conversation we'd had before. And I asked him if he'd mind talking to me about it. And we talked over many weeks, and he sat for many photographs and drawings. And I built this portrait up of him. The reason it says Magna Carta up there is because Max was writing, or is writing, a book on the Magna Carta. And also at the side there, they look like brain scans, but they're actually piano keys, because he's a pianist. So it all has sort of relationship to who he is. And this is what Max wrote about epilepsy, which I think is really quite extraordinary. If you're blind, you're blind. You don't have blindness. If you've got a cold, you've got a cold. You are not cold. I have got epilepsy and I am epileptic. It's a constituent part of me in the same way as if I'd been born with one leg. The next thing in this portrait with Max, I wanted to find a picture of a man deep in contemplation. And I took hundreds of photographs of him, many of which he looked much more handsome in and he'd been much more pleased with. But this, I felt, was a very contemplative picture. And there we go, the old Catholic Italian comes back in again. And there are the feet, and this time the nail looks like it's gone through the foot, and that's just a blob of ink. And Max carries on writing about the epilepsy. It's an insult to everything I would like to think of as myself. I can't therefore say that my brain and myself are identical. So Max, in a way, was talking to me about the stuff that actually draws me into portraiture. What is the relationship between yourself, your brain, and these very sort of serpent-like marks at the top and the bottom? I don't know how I can mention serpent again in the biblical context, but there you go. That's my own brain scan blown up, because again, one of the things I'm always aware of is it's my portrait of someone, and in that sense It's a portrait in a moment. It's not the truth of Max, it's my opinion of him. And the final person I made a portrait of for the epilepsy portraits is Fiona. And Fiona said to me, sometimes people notice it, sometimes you're in the middle of a sentence, but you don't make it to the end. It is like a momentary lack of consciousness, not for long. It's not a total loss of consciousness. You don't faint, you don't drop to the floor, you just stay the same. The condition itself, I really can't do anything about it. It is simply part of me, who I am. And that's why these portraits are very dear to me, because they actually, because of the nature of epilepsy and the nature of the relationship to self, I feel that both the sitters and I went on a very philosophical as well as an artistic journey to make these works. And when you see the works in the gallery, they are not one big piece of work, they're tiled works. They're made up of 9 pieces. And that's partly to do basically with the size of the etching press. I can't put a sort of huge piece of paper through it. But also because I actually think by breaking down the portrait into different pieces, it shows the multifaceted nature of who we are, when none of us are just one thing. Even in religious illustration, they often break down pictures to tell a narrative, and that's in a way what I'm trying to do with these pictures. So we've been on a whole journey looking at the self and the brain, and very recently I've suddenly got obsessed with the brain again. I haven't. I'll get there in a moment. I've gone back to the Cohen studio recently, and I've been working on genetic coding. And this is a series of works that was the first one I made, and I worked back to the beginning. And I've just finished them, so I'm not sure about them, but I thought they'd show you again, because genetic coding is another way of describing the self, and it's another path that I'm about to go down. So that's the order I made them in, and that's the order they should be, and I'm going to move on quickly because I need to come to terms with them outside of the lecture. But a few months ago, I was asked to go to Hammersmith's Hospital with a group of artists to watch a brain dissection at the Brain Bank of the Parkinson's Society. And I've always had a huge respect for Helen Chadwick, whose wonderful self-portrait you can see here. And the thing about Helen's work there is obviously it can't be a self-portrait. If you were holding your own brain, you'd be dead. So I asked if I could have a photograph taken holding a brain, and I just sort of couldn't believe the size of it, the feel of it. And I wrote this when I was holding it. Holding the brain was a moment of total connection with the brain as object. The cold, rounded, intestine-feeling outer edge of the brain feels etched in the memory of my hands this morning. It was colder and heavier than I'd expected, but it was not an object. I cradled it like a baby, protective, respectful of holding someone very vulnerable in this disembodied state. The object momentarily became the person in my hands. And so I went to see the Professor Dexter, who'd done the dissection, and asked him if there was any way I could work with him again, making work about the physical brain. I feel like I've sort of come full circle. Brain scans are interesting, but they're digitalized imagery. They're not the real brain. And I felt that I really wanted to make a body of work about the real brain, which I've just started on. And I've got permission to work with the brain. The brains that I'm working with are donated by people who've been given permission to use them for science and for art, and obviously in a respectful way. And I'm working with the Parkinson's Brain Bank in order to try and demystify the brain as object, because people often leave their bodies to science, but they don't like to leave their brains because they feel that they're imbued with something else. And I'm hoping that my work both will explore the brain as object and also will demystify it as object. I'm working again with Nigel Oxley, who is my great mentor and collaborator, and we've been printing off real brain slices, and these are going to be shown at GV Art in an exhibition called Transience, and this is a sneak preview of some of the work that I've done. A brain slice seemed to have no texture, and I couldn't believe that we got from the slice of the brain these rather beautiful, slightly three-dimensional and very alive-feeling images. And finally, we caught these images, which we've called passing thoughts. They existed for about 10 seconds and then evaporated. So I'm going to finish there. I hope I've sort of explained the journey I've been on as an artist into becoming a sort of portrait artist, and I'm hoping that my work will go on in that way. I'm about to start some new projects, and I'm also going to show quickly a short film I've done called Memoirs, which is an autobiography of someone called Daniel Paul Schreiber, who wrote a most amazing book called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, the first document ever of schizophrenia. Thank you. And afterwards we'll have questions.
I just wondered, I mean, it seemed very obvious in the film actually, but also in your print work, that you're almost using the kind of communal history of media, of film and photography, and also the printmaking techniques as some sort of metaphor for consciousness. And I just wondered, maybe if you could say something a bit more about that. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, I don't know.
It's both a metaphor for it, and it's exploring the process of it in the same way, I think. I mean, particularly with the printmaking, I'm trying to, particularly with the early prints, was trying to get a sense of chemistry and consciousness on the plates, but it is always using, it is a metaphor. I'm trying to get through to something we don't understand. And I think in the film that we've just seen, I've used all archive footage because it was someone else's story of their schizophrenia, so it was their consciousness. And I really loved the fact that I could borrow all that archive footage in order to tell someone else's story. So it's their story with my mark on it.
Moving on from that, I actually wanted to ask, I know that you've actually included some of your own brain scans in portraits of other people, and I wondered whether you could say something about that, sort of how you felt that sort of fitted into their portrait in a way.
Well, it's because it's partly sort of postmodern, it's partly a sort of modesty. I think my portraits are just one version of them. I would never, it's not how they would want to be represented forever, and it's not how they are forever. And my work is very much philosophically about being in the moment. So by putting my brain scans in there, I'm trying to let the audience know that this is just one moment in time. It's no more than that.
Yeah.
Susan, could I ask, could you say a little bit about the responses you've had from the scientists you work with to the work you've been doing?
I think I choose my scientists very carefully because I've had wonderful responses from them, and the only way you can work with scientists are if they want to work with you. And so right from the early stages of Dr. Butler at the Royal London Hospital through to the Professor Whittington and Dr. LeBeau up in Newcastle, there have been people who engage very much with my work. And we're very certain that I'm not trying to do science and they're not trying to do art. I see it as very separate things. It's not collaboration in the way I collaborate with Nigel or Stanley in making my work. That's true collaboration. What I have going on with my scientists is very much an exchange of knowledge, and they very kindly let me go and be in their environment, and that's what I find really valuable.
You said if you'd been working 100 years ago, then expressionism would have been you would have been an expressionist. But your work, and particularly that film, really reminded me of the Surrealists and Dali in particular. So, is that important for you, that movement?
No, I think you're exactly right. That film is very much Buñuel, Dali. It has that sort of feel to it, and deliberately. It's partly because the text was written in the early part of the 20th century, It's also, I think that there is a language from the surrealists about the mind that I very much wanted to tap into. So, well spotted.
Hi, Susan. I was just going to ask you, how did you go about printing with slices of brain?
That's a big secret. I'm not prepared to divulge it, but it was done. It was done with the real brain and a real etching plate, and extraordinary technical skill by Nigel.
Hi, I have a cluster of questions. I'm not quite sure how well I can articulate them, but one of them relates back to what this gentleman said here earlier about how, and it struck me because you started out by saying that if you'd have been working back at the beginning of the 20th century, you'd have been an expressionist. And your work is beautiful. I find it fascinating. And it does have a feel to it. And it still has, like you said, that drawing is very much a part of your work. And it does have that sense of something quite a direct, tactile sort of drawing experience, even though you're working very technically with it in print. And I think there's a nice balance between that. But I'm slightly a bit more interested in something you haven't touched on so much. You have slightly, and I wondered how much it interested you, that the imagery you're taking using scans and, like you say, the way that the scan is used, the brain scan is used, obviously, repeatedly throughout sort of media and newspapers to signify something, to signify the idea of the brain. And you haven't said much about that because your works do appear quite, they're not expressionist, but they're very kind of playful and decorative and explorative in that kind of direct way. But you haven't said too much about how though the meanings that you're using of something, of imagery, which is then used in a different context scientifically. So I don't know if I...
No, if I understand what you're meaning, brain scans are fascinating things. I know that there's a group of Dutch philosophers I've worked with who are very interested in the context of the scan. So often if you've been to a hospital, people want to take home their own brain scans because they feel in a way it sort of signposts some sort of interiority, I think. And they have a sense of it, but it doesn't show the mind. It actually just shows the anatomy. But we sort of feel that it shows the mind. So I think I certainly try and use it in my work in that sense of a signpost that I think people will get. That
and therefore you can use it and recontextualise it in this way as a direct signifier for that kind of sense. Since
holding that brain on that sort of dissection day, I suddenly want to get back to the real thing.
There's a difference between that thing of the imagery, the scientific imagery, but then something which has a kind of a tangible objecthood to it.
Because I'd forgotten how visceral a piece of flesh is in a sense, and brain scans are quite clinical in a way. I mean, they just... and so they're enormously exciting, and it's incredibly exciting that we can see inside living bodies, which is another reason why, many practitioners, not just me, are using brain scans in the 21st century, because there's a whole realm of imagery that we've never had access to before, which is the inside of a living body, which is, both a portrait and a fantastic landscape.
Okay, Susan, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.